Hello, Internet. Hello, Facebook. Hello, YouTube. Anywhere else this video may appear. My name is Samuel Huber from SamuelHuber.net, Huber Family Adventures on Instagram, Samuel Huber on Facebook, and this is part of my new series that I've just started this week called Heroes of Autism. I'm here with Dr. Eric Mitchell. Eric, can you tell my audience a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've been working with folks on the autism spectrum for many years, probably 20 some odd years now, and autism also runs in the family as well. So there's kind of a personal kind of connection. Also, I think there's some of us that kind of feel part of the community, not just professionally but personally. And when you have those two things that intersect, then you kind of like becomes your life. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from as well.
Definitely, same here.
Yeah.
So you've been in the field 20 years working with autistic people. How has your perspective on autism changed over the years?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, I think that when I first started working, in the fields, I guess technically almost 30 years as a volunteer, from when I started volunteering, I think that at that time autism really wasn't known. It was just, something that I'd say, well, I work with autistic kids, and it's like, oh, I'm artistic myself. It's like, no, not artistic, it's autistic, and I'd have to explain what that meant. So I think the biggest piece is that we've gone through the whole awareness phase into more of what I consider, and what a lot of people would consider more of an autism acceptance, and maybe even what we call appreciation. So instead of Autism Awareness Month, which is the month of April, typically people have started to relabel that Autism Acceptance Month. I'd like to think of it more as an Autism Appreciation Month. So we appreciate not only the struggles, but the strengths of folks in the autism spectrum. I think that perspective is something that started to be much more mainstream as far as people's consciousness goes. It's not just like autism is something that that destroys people's lives, like the way that some of the old kind of ad campaigns or fundraising campaigns used to say. It's really something that makes us different in the way that we see the world, not less than, but different in the way that we see the world. And sometimes that works out quite well, and sometimes that can present a lot of challenges. So it's that whole nuanced perspective. It's not just one thing, it's a whole spectrum perspective. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think another way we could call it is an autism celebration, because it is a celebration of how people think. And I think you're right that we need to shift our way of thinking, because they're still teaching parents that you should spend time grieving for your child that you lost. And some parents I've seen never come out of that. Like they're 20 years later, they're still grieving rather than celebrating the individual that they have. Which leads me to my next question for you. What are the challenges facing young adults on the spectrum today versus when they were in the school system and had all that extra support?
Right. So, I mean, a lot of folks are, familiar with the difference between what's called IDEA and ADA. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which protects the rights of people for equal opportunities for education up until really the age of 21 if they have an IEP. But all that stops when you leave high school. And then you're only protected under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, in college and in employment opportunities. And that provides what's called a reasonable accommodation. So that's very loosely defined. So for some companies or some universities, that's, you can have a great deal of accommodation and wiggle room in how you're supported in those positions. Mm-hmm. In other places, it's almost like a scarlet letter, that the A word becomes, or, the A in autism becomes almost a scarlet letter that prevents you from really moving forward or even maintaining a position. And different people have very different experiences with self-disclosing and gaining those accommodations to help them be those wonderful employees that they really can be, or wonderful students, college students that they can be. So it's, I think that's the biggest piece of, coming into adulthood is, trying to figure out, how to present oneself, and then to be able to work that to your advantage, finding those safe havens and safe people to disclose to, and making those folks aware enough so that they see your strengths, not the things that are so challenging. Accommodate the challenges, yes, but really maximize and emphasize the strengths of what it means to be on the spectrum so that they can be really invaluable assets to that business or organization.
So this that's a lot of great info. Um, how does someone on the spectrum start that conversation though? How does someone say, "Hey, I'm autistic. Here are my strengths"? Because I worked with a lot of young adults through your center that don't know how to even begin that conversation. So for the young autistic adults that may be watching this video, how does one start a conversation and make sure it's a positive one?
Right. So one of the things that I often recommend is to have a wing person, somebody that you can have that conversation ahead of the actual conversation. So somebody that you're talking about, well, should I, what are the pros and cons about going to my employer and asking for an accommodation, or what are the accommodations that I should ask for? Sometimes different employers or universities will require, universities especially, will require some kind of documentation. And so if you have a provider or an assessment, could be something that's left over from the educational days that kind of starts to outline what those accommodations should look like. It gives you a lot more evidence to kind of back up what your needs are and how you can be successful. That being said, the final evaluation before you leave your high school education is probably the most important piece of paper that you can take with you aside from your diploma, from your high school education, because that document, that last evaluation, if it's done well and has kind of accommodations listed out that could be relevant for under ADA accommodations, not just school accommodations, but Americans with Disabilities Act accommodations for higher education and workplace. Those things you can point to and say, this is the document by a professional that says that I need these to be successful. That document, if you're talking with a therapist or a family member or another person on the spectrum who, is familiar with how to self-advocate, you can make the decision to take that piece of paper and bring it to an employer, so your HR department, not necessarily your supervisor, but to your HR department once you're actually in a job, because sometimes it's easier to get a job than it is to keep a job, but we'll split those out another time. You can take that piece of paper to your employer, your HR department, and say, okay, please keep this in my file because I'm an individual with a disability who may need an accommodation, if not now, perhaps one is discovered along the course of your employment that would be very helpful. So I've had, human resource, directors come to me and say, if only this person had disclosed that they were on the spectrum, we could have made some accommodations for them, but they'd never disclosed, so we couldn't make the accommodation. We would have been happy to, because it's a pain in their butt to have to go back and, try to hire another person for that position. Maybe they work out, maybe they don't. There's strengths that a person had to get that position in the first place as an autistic person, or just as an employee, that company is losing. They're losing an asset. They don't want to lose an asset. They want you to come forward and request that accommodation so that, number one, they can make a successful business roll and not have to go out and hire more people. But number two, because the U.S. Department and what is it? The Employment Department for the United States is starting to buckle down on the percentages that employers are maintaining with people that identify with this disability. So you're not just helping yourself by disclosing to the right person at the right time. You're actually helping that company or that university when they get audited by the Department of Labor. That's what I was reaching for. When the Department of Labor comes to audit them, their numbers are going to look a heck of a lot better, and they're not going to have to be exposed to a whole bunch of other liability there. So it's a win-win situation by disclosing if employers really realize that. Not everybody in an organization is going to realize that benefit. You know, there are certain HR people that typically do, and they're required to keep that information confidential unless there's some extenuating circumstance or something like that, and you ask them to disclose to a supervisor or what have you. But there are some other people that aren't going to understand what that document means. They're not going to understand that you have rights and you have value that may need to be accommodated for to make you successful. Those people can kind of be an authority on your side in the job place. And if you don't have something in your HR file to back you up, if something were to happen, it leaves you kind of high and dry. It leaves you without really any kind of backup. You know, your company is your backup, or your organization is your backup if they have the information, but they can't back you up if they don't have the information. So I also think that, you know, there's some people that come to me and they say, well, you know, what if I disclose and, you know, it just backfires and they fire me anyway and so on. And that is a horrible situation.
Mm-hmm.
There is some legal recourse if you know, that you can talk to an attorney or whoever it is that, you know, an advocacy organization, to go and try to, you know, take care of that situation legally. But also, is that an employer that you really want to be working for in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody that's going to diss you and kind of try to, you know, kick you out of there or whatever because you have a certain disclosed disability that, you know, makes things a little bit more challenging in some way. I don't know if that's really a safe haven. You know, and for some people, they've been searching for years where they don't have a job. That's okay. You know, to a certain point, but, you know, they get to the point where they're like, I just want to have a job, and whatever they have to do, they're willing to do, even if it means trying to act neurotypical or pass as neurotypical, in a situation where they probably are really struggling and people see them struggling. And that's really hard to maintain, to be someone who you're really not on the job place. So, you know, anyway, I kind of went off there.
That's all right. That's what this is for. Your wealth of information. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest thing that I've seen with clients and my efforts to find a new job. It took me like 5 years to find a new one. It's like, yeah, I went into all these interviews and I had tried to pass myself off as neurotypical rather than be myself. And it wasn't until I went to the Center of Autism where I work now and really display my wealth of knowledge. Like, I think that's the biggest thing that young adults on the spectrum need to understand. Play to do what you're passionate about, and also play to what you know. And what I know is the spectrum. I also run into a lot of clients, Dr. Mitchell, that can get a job, but they keep losing their job. Either they run out because of the social aspect, not the job itself. What can autistic people do once they get the job to maintain it? What do you find they often are what are they missing here?
So, you know, and this is a very big question. I don't know if there's an easy set of answers. I think that a lot of jobs, you know, it really depends on how much support and what type of job it is. But I think the job selection, the type of job that you're going for, should match as closely as possible your skill sets and your interests. So, you know, we talk about ability and we talk about interests when we talk about, you know, kind of vocational development and vocational counseling. If, you know, the old saying goes, if you love what you do, you'll never work another day in your life because it doesn't feel like work. You're just doing what you enjoy. I think that becomes one of the biggest pieces, but also something that is really kind of in your wheelhouse, something that you really had the skill to accomplish. If those two things line up, your ability as well as your interests, your skills and your interests, then that's a wonderful place to be. Once you're in that position, you're likely to be successful if those two things match up. There's some folks that get into fields that they really don't have a lot of skill in or they don't have interest in, and then they find themselves either you know, being bored or, you know, feeling like they're misplaced or what have you, or that they're just in over their head because their skill doesn't match up to that position.
Right.
Those are situations that aren't likely to go well for you. With a lot of folks on the spectrum that I work with, you know, socialization is a difficult thing. And so they find themselves, say, in a customer service position, or they find themselves like, you know, in a very people kind of oriented kind of position, and they're not comfortable. They're not successful in that way. Whereas they get themselves into, another type of position that is, whether it's technology or whether it's organizing things or, numbers or what have you, and that may be much more in their wheelhouse. And so they find themselves being much more successful. So I think a little bit of, whether it's a full vocational assessment or just kind of knowing yourself and talking with folks that, can help you find that position that fits you, I think there's a lot of value at the front end. Once that position is established, once you get that job and staying in that job, then it becomes a matter of observation at first. So, coming into a job, I do this exercise with one of the courses I teach at Drexel for the Drexel Autism Support Program. Do you want to be a person that comes in knowing the job and just starting from the get-go and not needing any kind of guidance and just flowing with it? Or are you somebody that is going to come into a job and observe others and kind of learn from others and be that Jane Goodall with the apes, observing first and then figuring out what makes people successful in this job, and then using that information to mold your own behaviors after that, you feel comfortable engaging it. Now that you've observed all of these people working and getting advice from them, now you start to adopt certain work practices. That question, I think, is really important to figure out. There are many folks on the spectrum that have amazing minds and they have amazing skills, but sometimes they don't necessarily want to listen to what others are putting out there. They want to do what they feel they want to do at that particular time. And that can be wonderful if you happen to be in line with what the current expectations are on that job. But if that's not what people expect, then you run into problems. So again, it's great to have those skills. It's great to, to be knowledgeable and so on. But we at first had to do that, use those social observation skills to figure out what the code is on that job, what the expectations are on that job, what makes people successful, and then see if we can fit our skill set into that skill set. Sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge for folks on the spectrum to be able to hold back that long, to be able to really operationalize a sense of what's expected. The other piece is, again, the idea of a wing person also extends into the job itself. So if there's somebody that's a supervisor, a mentor, somebody that you can look to for guidance that really kind of has your back, that person becomes invaluable. That if there are other folks in the organization that don't understand you as much, that person can be a liaison, because neurotypicals aren't great at direct communication.
No.
Most folks on the autism spectrum, I think, tend to be much better at direct communication than most neurotypicals are. So neurotypicals aren't going to come to you necessarily if they have a concern. They're going to go whisper down the lane, to other people. And if there's somebody that is your, kind of wing person, confidant, mentor kind of person, that person can run some interference for you and get people to reorient how they see you as an employee. That's not something that you can necessarily do on your own, because you may not know that people are saying these things. So, yep, exactly.
Excellent. All right, we're running low on time, but there's a couple quick things I would like to talk to you about. For those of you who don't know, Eric Mitchell is the director of the Rotenberg Center. Eric, can you tell us a bit about your center?
Sure. So the Rotenberg Autism Center, named after actually now the late Bert Rotenberg. He actually passed away a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately, at the ripe young age of 97 years old. So
Wow.
Bert was kind of a pioneer in the field of autism. Opened the first autism center, the Center for Autism, of course, Sam, where you're affiliated, in the 1950s, and was kind of the precursor to Stanley Greenspan, as a kind of a relationship-based kind of, pioneer in the field. Not as much on the behavior side, but more establishing relationships and using those relationships for a sense of growth for individuals on the spectrum. And that model has kind of survived to this day. We also add in behavioral aspects of that model. So we're the sister or the kind of affiliate organization with the Center for Autism, but we kind of take more of a consulting perspective, so that if there's things that other organizations are struggling with, that's when some of our experienced consultants can come in and interface with those individuals, whether they're adults, whether they're kids, whether they're trying to figure out some assessment questions or some services questions, and try to get them through to that next level of support so that they can be successful. So from a consulting kind of perspective, that's what our job is, as opposed to the center-based services perspective that's the Center for Autism relies on. So, and we do have some folks in common that go between organizations, of course, such as, of course, yourself.
Yes, I've enjoyed talking at your center a few times.
Absolutely.
I like to end all my interviews for this show with one question. How would you like the general public's perspective of autism to change?
So, I think we've made a lot of progress, but as Frederick Douglass says, without struggle, there is no progress. There's been a lot of struggle involved, and there will be a lot of struggle in front of us as well. I think that even though we've gotten past the kind of alarmist thinking of what autism is as a diagnosis and a fear-based kind of, association with the A word, as, if you will, that I think we still have a long way to go to really get people to understand a nuanced kind of broad perspective of strength and gift. That there are certain things that individuals on the spectrum and anybody that they work with in their entire in the entire autism community and beyond, that there's huge struggle and there's huge areas for success, and it's not one or the other. And I think that people have to understand that. I think that people like an easy explanation. We're in the
Right.
cookie cutter society of fast food and so on. It ain't that simple when it comes to autism. And I think that nuanced perspective is something that I hope people will adopt a little bit more frequently.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric. I love that answer. One of my favorites so far. So how can people get in contact with you if they want to do a therapy session, get involved in the center?
Sure. Well, I think the easiest way is usually through email. My own private practice email address, and which I can float folks over to the center from there as well, is ericmpsych@yahoo.com. So ERIC, M for Mitchell, first four letters of psychology, PSYC@yahoo.com. So.
All right, awesome. All right, everyone, this is the end of this episode. If you like what you saw today, please subscribe to the channel below. Dr. Eric Mitchell, thank you for stopping by today.
Thank you, and thanks for all you do, Sam.
All right.
All right.
Talk to you later.